Welcome, everybody. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. We do have a special guest joining us. So it's going to be a great conversation tonight. If you've got questions for me or my guest, feel free to send them in like normal. It's going to be fun. So let's do it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All righty, everybody. Before I bring my guest on, just a quick announcement that every morning on the Center for Political Innovation YouTube channel, we have morning messages. And I just scheduled one for tomorrow. I'm not going to tell you who it's from. It's always a surprise. Different members do them every morning, and they're really, really a great way to stay plugged in with our community. So I'm putting the link in the chat. Go subscribe to the YouTube channel. Go set your notification to watch tomorrow's morning message. It's really great. I just watched it, and it's really inspiring from one of our members. Not going to say who, but it's great every morning. I mean, we have a great morning message. The theme is start your day with revolutionary hope and optimism, and we do them every single day. That is the goal. Every so often we miss a day, but it's not the end of the world. But there we go. So I just want to remind folks to do the morning messages. And quickly, if you feel like submitting a morning message, if you're a friend or an ally or somebody who likes this YouTube channel and you'd like to make a morning message, we have that option as well with this special link that was created by our friend Peter Coffin. You can upload the video here and make a morning message. So if you'd like to submit one, all you have to do is go to that link. You can record it right there with your phone and send it in. It's all about supporting each other and standing with each other and giving people the optimism and hope they need to get through this world amid the pessimism and all the ugly things that we see. So I just want to remind people they have the option of making a morning message. So on that note, I'm going to bring on our guest out in the Pacific Northwest, our good friend, Terri Strange.
Hi.
How are you? How have you been?
How are you doing? I've been all right. Life is plugging along.
Very good.
Yeah. The Lord gives me things to do each day. So
there we go. It's still broad daylight out there where you are. I see the light. It is pitch black here in New York City. It is 4 minutes past 10. So there we go. So the idea that we had for this stream, it came to me. So when I was, chatting with you over the course of the last few months and last year, really, you shared with me that you are religious now and that you are of the faith American Baptist. So I thought I didn't know the different types of Baptist. I know that there's IFB, Independent Fundamental Baptist, and then there's Southern Baptist and all of that. I didn't know all of that. So the other day, just randomly, I looked up American Baptists on Wikipedia, of all places. The one place that is the source of all knowledge, totally not biased or anything. But
indeed.
And in the Wikipedia page for your denomination, American Baptist, they listed famous people who are of your faith, of your denomination. They listed John D. Rockefeller, which surprised me. But one that they listed was Kamala Harris, the Democratic Party presidential candidate. And I saw that and I thought, no, that can't be. So have you seen Kamala Harris at church on Sunday morning? Do you give her a high five, and walk in?
No.
Do you do Bible study classes together? I'm just kidding. Go on. So
No.
What do you make of this? Is Kamala Harris really an American Baptist?
Is she really anything? And I would just also say, just to correct maybe your introduction about my faith is Christian.
Okay.
but I belong and I'm a member and am serving in an American Baptist church.
Okay.
There are things in the denomination that I favor a great deal. So I will say that there's things about it that I think are, drew me in when I decided to join a church. But, it's as far as, being lockstep in line with everything that they believe. I don't know that that's always the case. But I think it's been a good fit for me and been a good place that I can, be a member of a church. Well, anyway, I'm not surprised. I wasn't surprised at all. My first response was kind of to shrug and be like, well, that kind of makes sense, honestly. I don't know about, what her actual religious convictions are. Who can really say? But it wouldn't surprise me that she would gravitate towards that, or maybe have been participant in it, or maybe even had attended it as a young girl.
Why?
Because of the civil rights history of the American Baptist Church.
Okay.
American Baptist Church has a strong history of, why it's called the American Baptist Church is because of the split that happened in the Baptist Church because of the Civil War. And the American Baptists were Americans. They were on the side of, abolition of slavery and very strong anti-racist doctrine from very early on. It's important in Baptist congregations. They're actually some of the most integrated churches in the country and in the world, actually, have very diverse church congregations.
So let me ask, just to clarify, is it a quote unquote historically black church or no? Because John D. Rockefeller is not black, obviously.
No, some churches are blacker than others. It depends on where you're at, really. But no, it's not. I mean, there's all kinds of congregations of all different kinds of people. In my particular congregation, and in actually many churches, they'll have often partnerships with like refugee groups. They'll do, because of missionary work or whatever, they'll establish relationships in different places and bring people in. There's a history of that. So we have a congregation of Cambodian people that have been having services in Khmer for 40 years in the Portland area. So it's pretty big in that. There's also a lot of Burmese people in the area as well that are involved in American Baptist. There's also a lot of Spanish-speaking churches. I was kind of touched by that, and I thought it was something interesting. But a lot of churches are white too.
Now, when you say Baptist, right? We generally, I grew up in the United Church of Christ, which comes out of the Congregational Church, etc. And I got more to say about that later. But I'm curious. When you say Baptist, you generally think of an evangelical or fundamentalist religion. Is that the case? Would you say you're literal Bible believers, etc., or no?
Yeah, they do believe that the Bible is the authority word of God. And a biblical, they're very strict, I would say, in that regard. I think there is a difference in between evangelicals, because when I was first saved, I was in an evangelical church. There's a lot of different characteristics. So in my church, for example, they don't really do a lot of the charismatic behaviors that you'll see in some churches. So there's not a lot of laying of hands. That may happen from time to time if somebody requests prayer, but it's not commonplace. You don't see people speaking in tongues or wilding out. If people raise their hands, it's getting a little bit, wild in the worship. That's about as far as it goes.
Sure.
So it's a bit conservative in that regard.
Is it a creationist church? Do they believe in the 6-day creation? Do they denounce Darwinian evolution?
No, not that I've come across.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
I'm not that, like I said, I'm not that engrossed in it, but there appears to be a diversity of thought about that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know that, because it's not exactly, I don't know. How would I characterize that? Definitely believe it's a creationist church in the sense that it's, believes that human beings were created by God and not, some sort of evolution. But I don't know about the 6-day thing, or
Okay.
haven't come across anything weird like that.
Oh, okay. No, I mean, it's interesting. In CPI, we have a member who is a Baptist, good friend of mine. Shout out if you're watching, Gavin. And he is a fundamental Baptist, and he is very much a 6-day creationist.
Gavin?
Yes. Gavin? Have you met Gavin? Did you get to meet him? I think you met him at one of our events once, right? If I'm not mistaken.
I think so.
Okay.
Maybe not.
Yeah, and he is a fundamental Baptist, and then I know there are Southern Baptists. There are many different kinds of Baptists, but my understanding is that what defines being a quote unquote Baptist is the belief that one cannot accept Christ as an infant. One cannot be baptized as an infant. You have to be baptized when you're like 14, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, no, not necessarily.
Okay.
We have a 8-year-old recently baptized, which was the age I was when I was baptized as well.
Oh, wow.
But it has to be a believer's baptism. You have to actually come to the faith of your own accord. It cannot be something that's done, over you. That's not believed to be real. They'll bless children. They'll do like blessings on children. They'll pray over children, when a family has a child brought, and agree to be a church family to the child, but the child themselves has to, as an individual, choose the baptism as an expression of faith.
Yeah, I think Mark Twain, the writer, he was asked, "Do you believe in infant baptism?" And his response was, "Believe in it. I've seen it," which I thought was kind of clever. I know, I think it was in Germany, right? There were the Anabaptists, they were called, that rejected the baptism of infants and were heavily persecuted. And the church that I grew up in, the United Church of Christ, which was like a merger of the Swiss Reformed Church and the Congregational Church, was actually descended from a guy named Ulrich Zwingli in Switzerland, who had persecuted Anabaptists because he believed that because they wouldn't baptize babies, they were causing all these people to go to hell. Any child who died before they were old enough to get baptized would go to hell. So he actually would execute Anabaptists for this heresy, what he considered to be a heresy, by drowning them. Forced drowning. Yeah. So the Reformation Wars, that period, was particularly ugly. And Ulrich Zwingli, the leader of the Reformation in Switzerland, was very violent toward Anabaptists. But I also know that in the German Revolution of 1848, which was, years after the Anabaptist movement started, much longer after the Reformation, the Anabaptists were the most radical people. They were like some of the most, revolutionary people in trying to establish a German nation state and overthrow feudalism, because they saw feudalism as violating Christianity, as saying that you have the divine right to rule over somebody is just absolutely, a distortion of the Christian faith. And I also know the reason that there are so many Amish people in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and Mennonites as well, as Mennonites and Amish people are also a breakaway from the Anabaptist movement in Germany, because they don't believe in baptizing infants either. And that's kind of the basis of what it means to be a Baptist, even though there's many different versions of it. I also remember that the church I grew up in, the United Church of Christ, for a while they went through a phase of referring to the biblical figure John the Baptist as John the Baptizer, because they didn't want to confuse him with a denomination. And it lasted about 2 years. And then they just kind of said, no, this isn't going to work. So they went back to calling him John the Baptist. But I thought that was amusing. But I mean, when it comes to politics, so, Barack Obama was a member of the Church of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And that was the church I grew up in, United Church of Christ, in Chicago. And it was a very large black church in Chicago that was notably pro-LGBT, but was very much, Reverend Jeremiah Wright was kind of into liberation theology, and he had flirted with black nationalism, was friendly. And I actually said on a stream at one point that I thought that, that in a lot of, and it's true that in a lot of major cities, the United Church of Christ is known as just kind of being a church that is pro-LGBT, and in a lot of cases, a majority black church that's pro-LGBT. Now, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, but someone pointed out, someone from Chicago, another member of our community, John McCarthy, in Chicago, he said, well, that is not a fair characterization of Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church at all. They were much more than that. They were pro-LGBT, but they were very much an activist-oriented, kind of a left-wing church, and that Oprah, I guess, was at least nominally a member of Reverend Jeremiah Wright's church, and that it was kind of a church that a lot of Democratic Party politicians in Chicago, especially African Americans, would join, but not really participate in. It was kind of like the memo was they would join on paper, or they would join this church on paper so that they could hold up and say, well, I'm a member of a church, look at this, and they would hold up the United Church of Christ of Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And is that possibly what happened with Kamala? Do you think that she just joined this church on paper? It was kind of, she made a financial arrangement so she could hold it up and say, I'm a church member. Is that possibly what happened? I'm curious.
Like I said, there could be so many different things. Just given her parents' history, I don't think it would be odd that she might have been raised in American Baptist Church. But I don't know.
She does talk about attending a black church in her autobiography. She calls it a black church. Her mother is from India, and that her mother wanted them to know their heritage as, because their father was from Jamaica. And she talks about attending a black church. She doesn't mention which one. She talks about that from her childhood in her autobiography. The other thing I was curious about, is that, there are obviously a lot of things about Kamala Harris. Not, first of all, let's just get this out there, right? No one is sinless. No one, lives purely according to the principles, and that just because one has a religious belief doesn't mean if you therefore do something that goes against it, you're a bad person, right? And that's one thing to be very, very clear about, right? Because that's one thing I see a lot of on the internet is people pointing the finger, hypocrite, your religion says blank and you do blank, so you're a hypocrite. Well, we're all hypocrites, right? That is a big part of the Christian worldview, right? Is that all of us fall short of the glory of God. No one is sinless. Would you agree? That is an important point that needs to be made before we even begin to talk about Kamala Harris, right?
I believe that people can become sinless through their life.
Oh, go on.
Through establishing and returning to the Father through Christ. We are, though, born into sin. So it is something that is a separation from God that we have to reconcile through Christ. But after that reconciliation occurs, I think that people can become sinless.
Okay.
So, am I there? I don't know.
Okay.
But I don't think it's impossible. I do think there are people who don't sin.
Okay. And so let's talk about Kamala Harris in that, we know that her career in San Francisco politics began by being the mistress of Willie Brown. Willie Brown was married and she was his mistress. She was his extramarital lover. And this was very public at the time. She would go to nightclubs with him and stuff, and she was all over the gossip columns of San Francisco as this beautiful young woman who was the arm candy of Willie Brown. Does that sound like American Baptist behavior?
No. But it is something that happens.
Well, of course. Yeah.
So, these things happen.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting about Willie Brown, and I learned this, so first of all, there are only 2 books critical of Kamala Harris, right? There are a lot of positive biographies. There's a little children's book you can read to children about how awesome she is. And but there are only 2 critical books of Kamala Harris that have ever been published. I wrote one, and the other came out earlier this year, and it's called Amateur Hour. And it was published by the Washington Times. And I read Amateur Hour, and I learned a lot from that book. They were kind of coming at Kamala Harris from a little bit of a different angle. Washington Times is a Republican Party aligned newspaper. So they were kind of critiquing her from a different angle. And what they said about Kamala Harris, what they pointed out is that Willie Brown, who, she was the mistress of, who became eventually the mayor of San Francisco, that his origins in politics are even more shady. He was the pimp lawyer. That's what he was known as. That the message went out in San Francisco that if a prostitute or pimp was ever arrested by the police, that Willie Brown could represent you and the charges would be dismissed if Willie Brown was your lawyer. He had some kind of arrangement with the San Francisco legal system that your charges would be dismissed. And I read that and my eyebrows went up quite a bit, because that's a particularly, if you're somebody who specializes in representing the sex trade, which, nowadays there's this whole thing about sex work being empowering and all of that. And I don't want to touch that, but we do understand that, in the 1970s in San Francisco, illegal brothels and all of that, we're talking about human trafficking. We're talking about, sexual slavery. We're not talking about, webcam girls. It's a little bit different regardless.
Well, regardless, it's, I don't, maybe I don't want to go there. I don't think it's decent or moral or, good for the individuals involved or society generally for prostitution to be occurring. And there's a reason why it's, had the history of repression it has. And there's a reason why in our current era, with the proliferation of so many different forms of what's called sex work, we're having a breakdown of society even further. I mean, it's causing all kinds of problems. But
indeed.
I think you're making the case about her lover here, that he was an immoral man and she was his mistress, though, which is scandalous.
She's not responsible for what he does at the end of the day, but the whole thing is a little bit, when you look at her origin story from that angle. We're talking, we've talked about Donald Terris, we talked about her father, but this is a little bit of a different angle with Willie Brown and with her being his mistress. But I'm also curious about American Baptists and the LGBT thing. Is there a position on that? Because she is at this point, very pro-LGBT.
Yeah, and the American Baptist Church isn't. It has come up a few times, I think, in recent history. It's not pro. There are certainly members of the churches who may have some sort of, identity that they hold on to for whatever reason that's in that category, or, are struggling with that in whatever sense. And they're definitely welcome, all people are welcome at the church. But in terms of having people openly serve who are, living that lifestyle and, as a part of affirming the lifestyle, definitely not.
That's interesting as well. And I feel like in San Francisco politics for Democrats, it is almost mandatory to be pro-LGBT. That goes back to they had the mayor. Well, first of all, let's talk about that, right? So I think she just died, Diane Feinstein, right? Diane Feinstein.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So Diane Feinstein, her nickname was Dorothy because she wore, kind of girly skirts like Dorothy in Wizard of Oz, and that a kind of a slang term for a homosexual was a friend of Dorothy, and that came because the woman who played Dorothy in the original Wizard of Oz movie
Judy Garland.
Judy Garland, her concerts were known to be LGBT homosexual cruising places. Before homosexuality was legal or widely tolerated in U.S. society, a place that one could find, that gay people could find other gay people, was Judy Garland concerts. And so the term friend of Dorothy became kind of a euphemism for a gay person. And Diane Feinstein was, what's up?
Well, I just want to interject. I think gay men are often attracted to just women like Judy Garland or Diane Feinstein, like these powerful women, or tragic women characters. I think they have some kind of identity with them to a certain degree, and they can relate to them, and they feel inspired by them. It's commonplace,
Yeah. Yeah, and Diane Feinstein was a member of city council she was a city alderwoman in San Francisco, and her nickname was Dorothy because she was known to associate with the gay community. She had a lot of gay supporters, and San Francisco was like a hub for gay people. And that started because the U.S. military had this policy that if you were found to be gay, you were kicked out. And it started during World War II, but up through the Vietnam War, etc. Generally, where you would get dumped if you got caught being gay in the U.S. military and you were kicked out for being gay was in San Francisco. And so it became kind of a known center of the gay community. And, she was this pro-LGBT, I guess, if you can call it that, or gay-associated, gay-adjacent politician in San Francisco. And she ran for mayor and lost to a guy named George Moscone. And George Moscone was also somewhat pro-LGBT, but George Moscone was like a socialist. He was a social democrat. He was like a Bernie Sanders kind of figure. And some people have said he was like the last far-left mayor of a major city in U.S. history. And he advocated guaranteed employment, and he was very sympathetic to Cuba. He wanted to send delegations from San Francisco to Cuba and such. And that George Moscone was a very far-left mayor. And Diane Feinstein ran on a platform of he was too far left. He was too far left and extreme. But George Moscone won, and he won the election because he had the support of Reverend Jim Jones.
Oh dear. Yes, I'm remembering this a bit.
Of the People's Temple, right? Which was this very strange religious sect in San Francisco that they followed this man who believed himself to be the combined reincarnation of Jesus Christ and Lenin in one body. And they eventually all committed mass suicide in Guyana, right? After some revelations came out. So George Moscone got elected, and he appointed Reverend Jim Jones to be the head of the housing board of San Francisco, which was quite an important political appointment. And Reverend Jim Jones was turning the housing board meetings into like religious revival meetings where he would preach his kind of weird apocalyptic, communist Christian, whatever, message. And, and he did faith healings and things like that. And then revelations started to come out about Reverend Jim Jones and some of his practices of, group sex and all kinds of things within the church that were, not considered good. So Reverend Jim Jones started moving all of his followers to Guyana. And then in Guyana, members of Congress went down to Guyana to inspect it because there were rumors that there were people there who wanted to leave, who were trapped or something like that. So they went down there, and a couple people wanted to leave with the members of Congress. The members of Congress were then shot on the airstrip. And then in Guyana, there was, it's generally called a mass suicide, but that's not exactly correct. It was, because some of the people that were
murdered.
Yeah, were murdered. Some of them, many of them were children. Many of them had it injected or were shot. I mean, it was a mass death. And until 9/11, it was the biggest death of American citizens in one single spot. American civilians that had ever been. At least 900 people died in the Jonestown incident. And George Moscone had been associated, had appointed this guy, the housing board commissioner, and all of that. So George Moscone was still the mayor of San Francisco. And Diane Feinstein was, a member, was a city alderwoman. So then, 2 weeks later, not, a little bit suspicious timing, 2 weeks later, a former police officer got into City Hall. He came in through a window and avoided the metal detector. And he came in and he murdered George Moscone. And he murdered also Harvey Milk, who was a gay elected official in San Francisco. He shot them both. And Diane Feinstein is the one who discovered their bodies. And within hours of their deaths, she was on the City Hall steps taking the oath, and she became mayor of San Francisco in the aftermath of the Jonestown incident and the murder of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. You want to talk about shady politics? I mean, that is like what was going on there. Now, I believe it was Dan White was the guy who shot George Moscone and Harvey Milk. Dan White received a 2-year sentence for killing the mayor of a major city. He received a 2-year prison sentence because he used the infamous Twinkie defense. And he said that he had eaten a lot of junk food and it had caused him to have a mental health breakdown that caused him to murder the mayor. After he, served his 2-year sentence, he then committed suicide under questionable circumstances. And also after the 2-year sentence was given to Dan White for murdering George Moscone and Harvey Milk, they had the famous White Night riots, they called them, which is, White Night, White after Dan White. The gay community went out and rioted and kind of burned down the stores in like downtown San Francisco and smashed windows and stuff. And Diane Feinstein was very famous for telling the police to stand down and let the gay riots happen. Basically, the gay community is mad, that Harvey Milk was killed, that George Moscone, who was their friend, was killed. And so she was famous for telling the gay community to just let them have their riot. And the police department kind of resented that, and without her permission, then started raiding the gay bars in retaliation for the White Night riots. The whole thing was very strange. And I mean, that was, 78 was the year that this happened, 1978. And that was kind of when San Francisco politics got ugly. People think of the early or the late 60s, 1967, 68, Haight-Ashbury, the Berkeley student stuff, which is where Kamala Harris's parents met. They met at the Berkeley protests in the early 60s and stuff. That had a kind of an optimistic vibe to it, right? We're marching for freedom. We're opposing the Vietnam War. It was kind of the hippie thing, and it had an optimistic vibe. But by 78, 79, with the Jonestown incident and the White Night riots and all of that, things had a very ugly and dark tone to them. It was not, peace and love and do your own thing, man. It was a very kind of sinister, dark, and that's kind of that tone that we get when we look at like major cities now. It's like this, the crime rate in the country was rising, inflation was everywhere, and people weren't feeling safe. And, the drug culture of the 60s had destroyed a lot of lives. And people, that was setting the stage for the war on drugs that came from Ronald Reagan, which was the crackdown. But what set the stage for it was the war on the drug culture of the 60s had a lot of impact. A lot of families had a family member who became an addict or suffered and all of that. And anti-drug, hysteria was rising to set the stage for Ronald Reagan to do what he did. And that was kind of the atmosphere in which the San Francisco Democratic Party that is today. I mean, and that's the Nancy Pelosi machine, the Pelosi family, that many people look at them and say organized crime. I mean, this is, a wealthy, powerful Italian family from, they were very powerful in Baltimore, and then they just kind of moved to San Francisco. And yeah, I mean, it's all very interesting, right? And that's what Kamala Harris, comes out of. She comes out of that sphere. So, yeah, I mean, and that's Willie Brown, where Willie Brown is rising as the pimp lawyer. And yeah, there's a lot of gross stuff there. And that's Kamala Harris's background. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know if I can tie her to all of that. But it is indeed, the environment that she kind of comes out of.
Yeah.
Miss London too. Yeah, it is interesting to consider her age, how her parents met when she was conceived, what she was growing up around, and then later where she kind of got her start in politics. It is all very seedy, but I mean, I think politics is generally.
Right.
I did get a super chat.
Yeah, disregard that. I don't. That topic is off limits. I've answered that, and it's just that's very. So just disregard that.
He would like to disregard that. Thank you for the super chat.
Thank you. But go on, continue. Yeah.
God. Oh, sorry, the chat.
That's okay. That's okay.
Hi, Yoda. Yoda's here. He's going to say some inappropriate things.
Oh, okay. These are people you know in your chat, right? So, okay. Very good. Very good. No, my usual crowd is watching as well. So
yeah, hopefully they enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We were Kamala's background, what she comes out of. Okay. I mean, again, I don't know. I don't know much about the woman, to be honest. Like, she seemed to me to come out of nowhere. I know she hasn't. I know she's had this kind of trajectory, but it just seemed odd. She was running for president when she was, and then the fact that she's kind of gotten into the position she has, it seems strange to me. Just, given, what her background is, what she served doing. I don't know. It's doesn't seem like preparation for president. But then again, Trump isn't really either. He doesn't have the political history in the same way. I guess it's really just whoever they're able to, groom and get ready for the position.
Well, I will say this. This is an interesting question. Now, I have certain thoughts in response to this, but it says, if Mrs. Harris is a Baptist Protestant Christian, why is she tolerating Israeli attacks on Gaza? Now, that's an interesting question because many American evangelical Christians, I would say the majority, are supporters of Israel. And in fact, many evangelical churches say that is almost a requirement for being a Christian, is you have to be a supporter of Israel. But I do know that one of the Israeli strikes destroyed a Baptist hospital. I don't think it was an American Baptist hospital, but it was a Baptist hospital that was targeted by Israel in the early, months of the aftermath of October 7th. Is the American Baptist Church a pro-Israel church?
I couldn't speak to that officially. Our members seem to have various opinions about the matter. There are people who are, openly pro-Israel, and then there are people who would lean more toward the being pro-Palestine. It hasn't really been something that I think there is an official thing on. After October 7th, as a church, we all prayed, and we prayed for several weeks regarding the war, and we still do sometimes, but there hasn't seemed to be an official position that I could speak to, but I may be wrong.
Well,
it's very normal. To respond to just that comment, many Christians in the U.S. are pro-Israel or, Zionist to whatever degree. So, it's not odd. But I don't think that she seems to ride the fence about that issue like many things. It's just she'll say whatever is politically expedient.
Well, that's interesting because after I wrote my book on Kamala Harris 4 years ago, someone approached me, and it was a person I had met before. He lives in the Bay Area. He's a piano tuner by trade, but also I believe he was formerly a U.S. diplomat with the State Department. His name is Paul LaRudy. And Paul LaRudy, I met him through his pro-Syria activism, but he's been a pro-Palestine activist in the Bay Area for many decades. And he's of Iranian descent. His family was born in Iran, but to a Christian family of missionaries that were there. And his name is Paul LaRudy. And he's been pro-Palestine. And he says that Kamala Harris is basically an Israeli creation. That when she was California district attorney, she got like an all expenses paid trip to Israel. She was kind of unknown. That was her first big electoral victory. And then she came back to the United States and she wanted to have, a meeting with pro-Palestine activists so that she said she could talk to both sides. And they walked into the room, and he walked into the room to meet with Kamala Harris, and she didn't give them she didn't have anything to say to them. She didn't listen to them. She just, just like, okay, talk. All right, thanks. No questions, nothing. She didn't want to engage with them at all. And that her profile started rising after that trip to Israel. And that's how she started to gain influence on the national stage. And she continues to fly to Israel pretty frequently. And after she got into the U.S. Senate and all of that, and that she is very much Israeli approved, etc. Now, though, go on, please. Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe you're going to get into it, but wasn't she recently didn't she have a meeting with Netanyahu that she didn't attend?
Well, that's the interesting thing, right? So she recently, pro-Palestine folks have been disrupting her rallies and protesting her. And she first said that, if you're protesting me, you must want Donald Trump. And the next time she said, well, she responded to them, I am going to make a ceasefire deal if I'm elected. Well, the thing is, she's already elected. I mean, Joe Biden's not running the country. Joe Biden is not running the country. And so she's already elected. And so what is she waiting for, right? That's very, very odd. But everybody knows that Muslim Americans are not going to vote for the Democratic Party like they once did because of the fact that, Joe Biden is supporting Israel and giving Israel everything it wants. And they're very upset about the bombardment of Gaza. And that Muslim Americans are concentrated in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, which are very key states for the Democratic Party. So she needs to sound like she's pro-Palestine to some degree or other, and that's really important for Joe Biden to win, but it doesn't match her actions. So that's important to be aware of as well.
I don't know that when it comes down to it, a president of the U.S. could really run on an anti-Israeli ticket. I don't know how that would happen. I just don't see it happening. I think it would be massive. There would just be so many things. Many reasons why that wouldn't be a good idea.
One election that was kind of pivotal for me, I was a teenager at the time, was 2004. You had Bush versus Kerry. Do you remember that election? You're like my age, right?
Yes. I think I'm slightly older than you, but not.
Really? I never would have guessed that. Okay.
Not much.
Okay. I find that hard to believe, but okay. Very good. I should look up to you as my elder then. But
much more mature, so that's good.
Oh, you're sweet. No, I find you to be very mature. So who knows? Once you're no longer in your 20s, age becomes very hard to detect. I've noticed, right? It's a sliding scale. But and I've always been saying Kamala Harris is well over 50 years old. I never say her age because you don't want to say a woman's age.
I don't really know it.
Right. Well, I've looked it up, but it's over 50. I just say well over 50, and I leave it at that. I don't want to. I think that's an accurate assessment without giving an actual number. Because I don't know, age is a weird thing like that. But 2004, the election. That was the year Bush ran against Kerry, and I think it was Pat Buchanan who said the election was Michael Moore versus Mel Gibson.
That's funny.
Yeah, because that summer, I remember, there were two movies that were box office, blockbusters. The first was Fahrenheit 9/11, and all the Kerry voters went to see that. That was Michael Moore's piece against Bush. And the other was The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, which was Mel Gibson's very religious film about the persecution and death of Christ. And have you seen The Passion of the Christ?
I actually haven't.
I haven't either. I saw Fahrenheit 9/11. I think I've seen clips of it on television around Easter time. I think I was in a restaurant and I saw some clips of it. But what's interesting is that both candidates, John Kerry and George W. Bush, huge supporters of Israel, but neither of the filmmakers, Michael Moore or Mel Gibson, were pro-Israel, right? Michael Moore dedicated his book, Dude, Where's My Country, to Rachel Corrie, who was killed by Israel. It was an American activist from Portland, I believe, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer.
She was from Olympia, wasn't she?
Olympia, yes, I believe so. Olympia, Washington.
To the north.
Yeah, and I think she went to Evergreen College, which is kind of a liberal college up there, and she was run over by a bulldozer.
Terrible.
Yeah, and then Mel Gibson, his father is a traditionalist. I think he himself is also a traditionalist Catholic, but his father, there was a big thing about his father doesn't believe that the Holocaust happened, or at least questions the Holocaust. And Mel Gibson, was drunk and made a lot of comments about Jews and such. And a lot of Jewish folks were offended by the movie The Passion of the Christ. They argued that some of the emphasis, some of the lines in the movie were like blaming Jews for killing Jesus. And so it was weird because it was like the American political establishment that is pro-Israel on both sides, both of them were kind of using filmmakers that were anti-Israel to like stoke up their base. And I thought that was interesting, right? That, you had people on the right that are anti-Israel, you had people on the left that are anti-Israel, and then both of the candidates were pro-Israel. And that kind of points to the dynamic of American politics and how weird these things can be. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't remember that being said, but I guess things have shifted then. But I don't know. Let's look at John Kerry and George Bush, not the filmmakers they're compared to, really.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't remember John Kerry's political involvement or his stances anymore. And, at the time, like I knew I wasn't going to be voting for either of them, so I didn't really pay much attention to either of them.
Yeah.
Who did I vote for that year? Let me think. What year was that? Was that 2004?
2004, yes. That was the year, 2004, mm-hmm. 2004 election. And what's interesting is that that particular election, John Kerry, he was the Democrat candidate, and he was just very, very boring. He had this very dull voice, and George W. Bush was pretty unpopular in a lot of ways, but he defeated John Kerry very effectively by having the gay marriage referendums on the ballot and turning out evangelicals to vote against gay marriage in a number of states. And they had the famous Swift boat ads questioning John Kerry's military record, etc. John Kerry went on to be Secretary of State under Barack Obama's second term. And that Barack Obama's second term, his foreign policy very dramatically shifted. So, the second term of Obama was about making the Iran nuclear deal, which John Kerry negotiated, which was about restoring diplomatic relations with Cuba, which John Kerry arranged the trip where Obama went to Cuba with John Kerry. John Kerry met with the FARC rebels that were negotiating and all of that. And that John Kerry was very much a deal maker. That was what he did. And that when Obama replaced Hillary Clinton with John Kerry, that was because there were disagreements within the White House. And I talked about that in my book on Kamala Harris, that the Obama White House, to some degree or other, didn't approve of what the Hillary Clinton State Department was doing. So there's many different angles to come at this, but hey, we can talk about whatever you want. What else is on your mind tonight, Terry? I have been, interacting with you for years, and you always bring interesting things to the table. You have knowledge in many diverse areas, right? I think I first found your channel, you were talking about communism, and then for a while you were talking about tarot cards and the mystical stuff, and now you talk religion, I think, on your channel a lot, right?
Somewhat.
So
or I read to my audience too. We read books together.
Nice.
I don't know. My channel's just always been something that whatever I'm into, whatever I'm thinking about, it's just been a place to express that and to get into it. I recently did go through and got rid of my all of the tarot reading videos. I repent of that action.
Okay.
That was not something to be involved in. And if anybody out there is considering divination or getting into that, I really, really recommend not doing that. So
tell me more. I'm fascinated. What is that like? Let me just say why.
I'm growing in my faith, and I understand that it's, I don't want to lead anyone astray by my content. It's kind of something that.
Well, I guess my question though is do you think that it works but it's sinful, or do you view it as just false religion?
Well, it's a multifaceted reasons why I think it's wrong. Whether it works or not, I mean, works. That even to get into that, you can easily make predictions. Or I mean, I know when I was a reader, I didn't even really get into much of that, and I didn't enjoy doing those kind of readings where people would want to have definite answers because the future hasn't happened yet. So I can give you, or somebody could give you a reading based on what the facts of the matter are today, but those things can change, and human beings are fickle and they're influenced by all kinds of things. So I don't know, that always seems strange to me, but usually I received, when I was a reader, information about people, definitely. I got messages come through, I had visions, I saw things, I opened doors to see things that I probably wouldn't have otherwise. But I don't think that it's there's a there was a toll it took on me, just as an individual doing that. And then the other thing about it that I think the first reason why I kind of gave it up was that I started to see that it was wrong to be going to these things before going to God, and to be relying on these things instead of relying on our faith, But then, I've kind of understood more the impacts of witchcraft on the spirit, and it's a form of witchcraft, and it is a work of the flesh, which I'm not trying to I'm trying to create in myself a spirit, that is holy and that is in alignment with God, and sowing to the flesh and doing works of the flesh like witchcraft is utterly devoid of the spirit. It's all wrapped up in this spiritual language, they pretend it's spiritual, but it's totally robbing your spirit. It's totally weakening your spirit. It's making your spirit ugly. So, I mean, you see these depictions of witches as like really hideous creatures. I had an experience where I saw my spirit at one point a few years back, where I saw, the real me. God kind of like lifted the veil, as it were, and kind of came through. And it's just I didn't like what I saw.
Wow.
I didn't like what I saw. I like my appearance generally when I look in the mirror. I'm like, all right, But what I saw that day was not pretty, but I knew it was me. I recognized it. And I knew it was like the twistedness of my spirit. So I think there is something to, practicing witchcraft of any kind that damages us spiritually. And it invites demonic activity into your life. My life was not good when I was in these practices. And as I've given them up, I've gotten a lot lighter. There's a lot less spiritual warfare going on. I don't recommend people get involved in that kind of thing. And my involvement was wrong. So.
Well, I have plenty to say on that. But before I do that, I'm actually going to make an announcement because we are getting some super chats here. So what I generally do is I do the opening remarks, then I do the roll call, and then we answer super chats. So I think what we'll do, since you have time, right? You're not like on a schedule or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to be off by 9. So.
Okay. What we'll do is after we go back and forth on this for a little while longer, we'll do a roll call, and we can if you want to help me call off names, that'll be fun. And then we'll answer people's super chat questions. So this is the first time I've done a joint thing like this, right? We've kind of done, but we'll just do the super chats together, so people can ask super chats to us both, and we'll answer them together. So that's the way we'll do it. So if you have something for the second half of the show for Terry and I to answer, send a super chat, and we'll answer it together. If it's specifically for one person, there we go. So there you go. So now back to the conversation. I can't relate to the witchcraft angle, really. I will say that one thing that surprised me was, my father is very much a scientific guy, a biologist, and very much, skeptical of religion in a lot of ways. The town I grew up in was very conservative and evangelical. So when I moved to like a more liberal area to go to college, I assumed that the people that were less religious would be like my dad. And what I didn't realize was that a lot of people that are not Christian religious, they do the witchcraft thing. They do the tarot readings, they do that. And that actually for Catholic teen girls, it's almost like a mandatory phase, which is interesting. For girls that are Roman Catholic, like at some point when they're a teenager, they get kind of feminist and they get into the tarot reading Wicca thing. It's like almost a phase they go through before they go back to being Catholic or stop being religious or whatever. And I thought that was interesting. So there's that. And, and then I guess I do what I can relate to, because I never really got into the witchcraft thing. What I can relate to is that with my return to Christ and my return to Christianity, it was very much about getting over the bitterness, right? It was for me that my politics, I had gotten into communism and I had been very angry as a young man, and that I had kind of embraced a very angry way of being. I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of resentment. And that as a young man in my 20s, I kind of spent my 20s kind of dealing with that. And my politics, in a lot of ways, was kind of an enactment of that. And that I saw that a lot of the older communists that I knew, their politics was also that, and they had never really gotten over it. There was one woman that I worked with closely. She was a boomer. And the reason that she had become a communist was that when she was in college, there was these group of people that were running around with the Vietnamese flag. Now, I would respect that. You're supporting the Vietnamese people in the struggle for national liberation against imperialism. But having gotten to know this woman, it wasn't that. It was they were being bad. They were waving the flag of the enemy. You know what I mean? And that I knew this woman, she kind of enjoyed lying to people. It was almost like a game she would play to lie to people. It kind of like thrilled her to lie and manipulate, people. And that she very much hated anything to do with Christianity because she saw it as the rules, as people telling her what to do. And that there was kind of this boomer teen rebellion contrarianism. That was what had made her a communist, right? And it was like she was kind of titillated by the idea of being bad, right? And as I got to know her, I worked closely with her, I didn't want to be that way. And I kind of realized that it took me years to kind of really put it together, but it's like, despite all of my anger, despite all of my resentment, I had become a communist because I wanted to be good, right? And she had become a communist, and a lot of these boomers had become communists because they wanted to be bad, right? It was being a communist was being the devil in America. And, and they were kind of titillated by the idea of being the devil, being evil, right? And I think that realizing that was not who I was, but also traveling and visiting anti-imperialist countries. And through my experiences trying to bring medical aid to Yemen, and through my experiences in Iran, realizing how important the work that we do is, right? All of that led to a religious experience in the Gulf of Aden that caused me to return to my faith. And so I feel like I can relate to that when you talk about what the witchcraft was doing to you, right? I think it's a similar thing. It's not exactly the same, but it's a similar thing. I feel that my soul, I gave off a very angry vibe I didn't smile very much. I was resentful. It was not, I feel like I've become a much more pleasant person to be around, and I have a much more positive and optimistic look on life as a result of rediscovering my faith. And that kind of came with that. So in that sense, I can relate to what you're saying. Does that, feel familiar? Does it seem similar in a way?
Sure. I mean, I had a spirit of rebellion in me for a long time. I don't know if it ever that's exactly what attracted me to communism exactly. Maybe it to a certain degree. I guess I did have an anti-authoritarianism just because, like, I always knew I wasn't getting the full story, and I always had a distrust of authority in the education system. So I kind of had to go out on my own and, learn for myself. I don't like anyone, and I still to this day, and I will never let anyone tell me, who my enemies are, who my friends are either. That's for me to decide and me to figure out. That's not, for the educational system to tell me, or, media or whatever. So I think, in my youth, being attracted to that was part of it. I also just was attracted to, the idea of it, I think, overall. So I think there was some rebellion in it for me. I definitely noticed it in people too. And it is hard to keep that kind of spirit going in a body. It does destroy people. I mean, people come down with all kinds of maladies from it. So I think a lot of things in my life, a lot of periods in my life have been a result of that spirit of rebellion that made a home in me, and that was like using me to create havoc in the world. So I don't know. Good question. I do think there's parallels. I mean, everybody is facing the same spiritual battle at the end of the day. It looks different in different people, but at the end of the day, it's a spirit of anger. We're facing good and evil in people. We're not warring against their ideology or whatever particular way this rebellion is taking place in them. It's the spirit of rebellion against God. That's what needs to be driven out. So we make a mistake when we look at the fleshly thing, the identity that they're having, whatever sort of approach they're taking to life. That's not it. It's the spirit that's driving them. Interesting.
Okay, so do you want to do the roll call now? And then it looks like we have a lot of super chats to answer.
No, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find all of mine.
Well, I've got them. I can put them on the screen.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, let's do a roll call. So
all right.
My viewers aren't used to the roll call, but this is a great part of Caleb's stream. So I hope.
Yeah, I can put them on the stream too. Both of our chats are in the StreamYard. So, all right, names and locations, folks. Names and locations. Terry and I will call you out as we see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Who is with us? Names and locations.
I'll do my people. You do yours.
All right. Very good. So I'll put some of yours on the screen. And all right. So Ryan in Kansas City.
Hi, Ryan.
Okay. Oh, hold up. They're going by very fast. So there we go. Ryan in Kansas City. Zenny. That's one of yours. That's Zenny.
So. Zenny is in communist Canada. Josh is in California, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Illinois.
All right. And we got April and Chris in Salt Lake City.
Original King Alpha in Tennessee. Sam from Missouri. F.U. Tommy in Australia.
Mr. Chip in Montreal. Very, very good. Right.
Z in a remote location. He's not putting it out.
Cali, that's one of yours. Cali vibes.
Okay. Yes. Josh. I already said Josh and Cali.
Tomas from Malaysia.
Hi, Tomas.
Very good. Balthazar in Oakland, which we talked about a lot earlier. That was like a focus of our stream earlier, was Oakland. So there you go. Right? Very good.
Don't post anything Tar Baby Yoda says.
Okay. We got Jorge in Europa Valley. Very, very good. Doc Green in Winder, Georgia. Good friend. Flower farmer. Good woman.
Hi.
Very good. All right. All right. Anybody else? Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. This is interesting. So I have a flavor goatee. So there we go. Unanimous in Woodland, California. Does he mean anonymous or is that what he means? Or
unanimous? I don't know. Leo in Woodland. Awesome.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Anybody else? Names and locations. Oh, Molly McGuire in Orange County. Good person. She's great. I think I if I'm not mistaken, I think I met her when I spoke out in LA about peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula, if I'm not mistaken. So there we go. All right. Juan from Italia. Very good. Anybody else? Names and locations. So, all right. So if you are watching this on my channel or Terry's channel, send a super chat. Give us something to talk about, because that's the fun of the second half of the show, is that we answer your questions, right? We may not give you the answer that you want. There's a couple topics that are troll topics that are off limits, but for the most part, I try to answer every question that comes in. Unless people are just trying to create trouble, which, this is the internet, so there is some of that. But for the most part, I try to answer every question. So there's a couple that have come in on your channel and a couple that have come in on mine already. I've got 4 in the works already, 4 super chats. If you have any more questions for me and Terry, just send them in. So first one is Battle Cossack. And he's a friend of ours from Argentina. Shout out to, I think his name is Gonzalo, but he goes by Battle Cossack. He says, there's being an effort to depoliticize the youth and make them apolitical. How do we combat this? What do you think, Terry?
Do we need to combat it? I don't know.
I feel like
what you resist persists, right? I don't know.
Yeah. I actually feel like I don't see that. I mean, he's in Argentina, so maybe it's a little bit different, right? But I don't see that. I feel like our youth are being politicized because the ruling class is divided, and there are different factions battling for power. And I think in politics, is being imposed on younger people. And it used to be everyone was into sports, people were into different things, but now younger people have politics pushed on them at a very young age by their school, by social media, etc. So I just don't see young people being depoliticized. I don't see an effort to make them apolitical. Do you, Terry?
I think people get tired of politics after a while. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I don't know. Maybe I've been depoliticized to a certain degree. I don't know that I have. I still hang out with a lot of politically minded people. I enjoy being around them and hearing their ideas expressed. But for me, I'm not very political, I would say, personally. I just happen to be around, fly on the wall. I don't think they're just trends. You don't really need to worry about it. Politics is life. They're going to come up. People are going to get involved when it's necessary to, and it's not going to stick. So I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question. This is on your channel. Leo Messi says, Caleb, thoughts on Candace Owens' pseudo-Nazi turn? You can answer it too. Do you want to go first?
Sure. I don't know. Has she turned pseudo-Nazi? I don't know. I used to follow her when she was with Daily Wire. And, there was a big controversy with her getting fired. She started kind of speaking out about the war between Israel and Palestine. But honestly, I kind of watched her first video when she came back and created her new channel, and I left a bad taste in my mouth, and I haven't been following her at all since then. I've been kind of like done with her.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, I just found her like it was very kind of vindictive, the video. And I find that about her content generally. She's very opinionated and judgmental, and she can be very harsh in her judgments of people. And I just feel like where she's at in her life, it seems odd that she, as a conservative woman, is still so invested in this very like egotistical career of hers. I don't know. Those are my kind of opinions about her.
Interesting. Very interesting. So I guess I will say that I just found Candace Owens to be a generally kind of boring. She was like the next generation of conservatainment, right? It was like Rush Limbaugh is, got old and died, and so now they rolled out Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens and people like that. I just kind of found her to be uninteresting, really, PragerU or whatever, until she started criticizing Israel, got fired from the Daily Wire. She had kind of a fight with Ben Shapiro. And, I don't know. The person said pseudo-Nazi. I don't know if that's the case, right? I think she's anti-Israel more than any mainstream conservative. And I think that, there is some overlap between her and Nick Fuentes. And Nick Fuentes is, fascist. I mean, he is, identifies with white nationalism, criticizes the Holocaust, that kind of thing.
I don't know much about him, honestly, either.
Yeah, well, Nick Fuentes, who I really don't like. I just don't like to hear him talk. Everything about him just seems smarmy and rude, and he is a racist, and he's an anti-Semite blatantly, and it's insult. It's like this weird far-right insult comedy that is popular among some conservative young men. They like it because they find it edgy. And I've actually had a theory about Nick Fuentes for a while that he is there to supplant any genuine far-right movement. He's not an activist. He's just a rude guy on the internet. You know what I'm saying? And he's been blasted like you wouldn't believe. They tend to suppress far-right content, and I don't want there to be a Nazi movement in general. I don't want a racist mass movement. So it's probably good that he's there to supplant such a thing, but he's blasted everywhere. I don't follow him. I never tweet about him, but I get his tweets showing up in my Twitter thing constantly, which is very odd. And that he's this young man who is kind of a racist shock jock, kind of, and then he kind of goes to war with any genuine far right, like Nazi organizing, any white supremacist organizer. He they're cringe, they're LARP, they're stupid, and so I have a feeling that he's been boosted, to play that role, to kind of supplant any.
Yeah, is he kind of like a destiny figure, but for the right, I would say? Kind of, yeah, I kind of got that impression too. He's like a fake right,
Yeah, and that's kind of how they're controlling, because this happens in all the dissident spaces, the far right, the far left. Obviously, there's names that come to mind. In addition to that, there's the libertarian circles, or certain boosted libertarian influencers who then target and have just really been nasty to Angela McCurdle, the chair of the Libertarian Party, who's my friend. And this is kind of how they control certain dissident communities, to make sure that they don't actually do real organizing. It just kind of becomes an internet fandom. Peter Coffin has written a great amount of work on this, about fandoms and how fandoms, they become less political over time. They're about the personality of the person, and all of that. And I see Nick Fuentes as a far right, racist fandom that is an attempt to kind of supplant any far right movement. And I don't want there to be a far right white supremacist movement, so that's not necessarily a bad thing. I just don't find him fun to listen to. But I have to say this, and I'm sure it's cancelable to say this. He did something very, very good last night. Right? Bad people for bad reasons can do good things. When Donald Trump was talking to Elon Musk last night in their space, Nick Fuentes mobilized all of his followers to put "no war with Iran" in the space. And the phrase "no war with Iran" was trending all over social media last night, thanks to Nick Fuentes. Good for him. If somebody, maybe because he's anti-Semitic, I don't care why. He said no war with Iran. And Candace Owens was also backing him up and trying to make no war with Iran go viral. And I think that is exactly what Trump supporters need to hear right now. because that, I mean, Trump appeals to people's desire to not have a war. And it appears that Netanyahu wants to expand the conflict in Gaza right now into an all-out war with Iran. So if someone is interfering in the Trump spaces to blast no war with Iran, that gets a stamp of approval from me. And that doesn't mean I approve of everything else that Candace and Nick have ever said, but they did that. Good for them. And, and that said, when Candace isn't talking about communism, right? I don't think she's anti-Semitic. I think she's anti-Israel, right? Nick Fuentes is anti-Semitic, right? Blatantly. But Candace, I think, is just anti-Israel. And she's kind of a cultural conservative. And then she's anti-Israel. When she says crazy things about, communism and, Biden is a communist and global communism and all of that. And I would happily
like right-wing people though, like they call everyone a communist, which is, exhausting, but
but other than that, I don't disagree with a lot of what she says. I just think she's kind of a cultural conservative who's criticized how cringe woke leftism has gotten. And on top of that, she's taken an anti-Israel turn when most of conservatainment is pro-Israel. I think it's interesting. It started with what I thought was very interesting. It was her and Vivek Ramaswamy. They were both at that time supporting Israel. She hadn't changed her position yet, but they did not approve of how they had the doxing truck that was driving around Harvard with the faces of students who disagreed with Israel. And they said, look, we did stupid things when we were in college. We took incorrect positions, and this is wrong. You shouldn't be ruining the lives of students at Harvard who disagree with Israel. And I thought that was a great point, because if the right is going to be against cancel culture, that should apply to Israel critics, not just people who are being canceled by the woke left. So I thought that was neat, and that was the beginning of the divide. So there you go. Any more thoughts on that one?
Oh, I don't know. I could probably go off in a million ways, but Trump was recently he had like a talking gig at a black like journalist. I can't remember the name of the event exactly, but the woman like immediately launched into him about all of these things, and she mentioned that he'd had dinner with like a white supremacist, and I guess I put it together that was
Nick. Yep.
Okay.
And Kanye was there too, so I mean,
sounds like a fun night. I mean, shoot, who wouldn't have dinner with, like, sounds like a bunch of characters.
I have a friend, won't say his name, but he works at a stadium in Long Island, and he actually got to work at a Kanye West concert. And he told me it was a very diverse crowd of people.
Yeah.
And he said it was people who just like the music, people who are fans of Kanye West, evangelical Christians, people that like some of the things that are more controversial that Kanye West has said. It was a very diverse crowd of people. And Christians too, because Kanye West has an evangelical turn. He did a whole album of Jesus-oriented music. So it was evangelical Christians, it was rap fans, it was Trump supporters, and it was far right people, and it was a whole mixture of a very diverse crowd of people that all love Kanye West. And he said that the concert was like it was announced and it was held like the next day, because if they had given enough time for it, there would have been protests and outrage, and the venue would have gotten boycotted and stuff. So they just it was announced, and then they had it the next day. But the auditorium was full of people to see Kanye West. So we live in strange times. I will say that much.
Well, he's an interesting figure, I have to say.
Indeed. All right, next question. It's well documented that demons are anti-Christian and anti-communist. Does this suggest that Christians and communists are both the good guys? That's Gavin, by the way, our Baptist member. Gavin. So he's not an American Baptist like you. He's a fundamental Baptist. So there's a difference. And Gavin would know the difference. That's what we love him for. So there we go.
I don't know anything about demons being anti-communist or not. I mean, what?
Well, I would say, Gavin, documented by who? I'm amused by that, and I think that's certainly interesting. And I would argue that the good side of communism, not the bad side, not the satanic rebellion side, but the good side is in line with Christianity. And I really recommend people read The Foundations of Christianity by Karl Kautsky, because even though that book is not, you may disagree with it theologically, the book does argue that Christianity was the proletarian movement of ancient Rome, and it makes
definitely appealed. Yeah, it definitely had mass appeal because of that. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty cool. Gavin says it's documented by Professor John Mack of Harvard University and many others. So, Gavin, how did John Mack interact with these demons? Like, what are you talking about? You kind of lost us here. You know, I'm open to this, but what do you mean? Like there you go. Is that your cat?
Mm-hmm. You might want to get on cam. Come on.
All right.
Come on, you can do it. There we go.
All right. Right.
All right. Yeah.
So you have a black cat, but you're no longer a witch. There you go.
Well, that doesn't have anything to do with it.
Okay. So you were never a witch, right? You were just somebody who did divination, right?
Oh, yes, I was.
There's probably somebody who just walked into the stream and heard me say that and thought Caleb is the meanest, nastiest person. He just wait. You
definitely was a witch. Yes.
You were a witch. Okay. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, then I don't feel guilty for saying what I just said. Yes. So there you go. There's probably somebody who had no idea about our previous conversation, who's tuned in and heard me saying, but you're no longer a witch. And they're like, my goodness, Caleb, you're being so rude to this, your ladyship, my lady who tuned into your channel. But there you go. You were a witch.
Pronouns.
Yes. Yeah. There you go. You were a witch.
Interested. Yeah.
Very good. Okay, next question. Gavin, we just don't know enough about it, but we're amused. We're amused. You know what I mean?
There is good and evil in all people. It operates through people. You just have to be able to read the spirits.
All right. Very good. More super chats are coming in. This is a fruitful stream. Awesome. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about the abiotic oil theory held by the Soviet Union and some other Eastern governments, which say that oil doesn't come from fossils?
Abiotic. I've never heard of that, but I don't think it would be untrue. I don't think, that it all does come from fossils.
Well, I got to say, look, if there's anything about oil, the Russians would know it. All right. If there's anybody who knows oil very, very well, it's the Russians. So if the Russians are saying something about oil, I tend to believe that they would know what they are talking about. I really doubt they would just be completely off when it comes to oil, because the whole way Putin saved their economy was by putting oil under public ownership. Interestingly enough, the Soviet Union's oil industry was created by Fred Koch, who was the father of the Koch brothers. Because he was a chemist in America who had been sued a bunch of times because he invented a way of thermal cracking and turning oil into gasoline. And all the big oil companies sued him because he had the patent, and they didn't want him as a competitor. And so he was kind of sued out of business in America. So he went over to the Soviet Union, and Stalin hired Fred Koch to set up the Soviet oil industry. So the Koch brothers, all their money comes from Stalin, which I think is pretty wild. Koch Industries, all of that comes from Stalin. But he was a wild anti-communist when he came back to the U.S. because he saw how efficient the Soviet system was, and he was terrified of it. And he was also aware of the political repression that went on. And I think, that's why the Koch brothers became like libertarians, free market advocates. And that's kind of interesting as well. The other thing is that peak oil. I remember peak oil.
Yeah, I remember that.
And that was malarkey. And peak oil, it was everywhere. It was considered, we're going to run out of oil in the next decade. It didn't happen. They invented deep sea drilling, hydraulic fracking. It was absurd. But it was a kind of a conspiracy theory or an eco-apocalypse scenario that was being pushed by the degrowth crowd. And it was actually big oil companies that were pushing the peak oil theory. because they want scarcity of oil, because the less oil there is, the more it's worth. And so if less people use gasoline and you drill less and all of that, then the value of oil goes up, right? It's supply and demand. And big oil companies are actually the biggest supporters of environmentalism because they'll get to write the laws because they're big, and their competitor is little oil companies that will not get to write the laws. And the fracking cowboys, they call them, the fracking companies, they tend to be lower level capitalists. The developing countries like Venezuela and Iran that have their own oil, right? So it tends to be the big ultra monopolies that push these peak oil. There's just not enough oil. We're going to run out of it, etc. scenarios. Russia is a big opponent of that. Russia has called out a lot of that. And so if Russia has a different theory about where oil comes from, I would be more likely to believe that than what the major oil companies in the West are putting out. Now, that said, science, I am not a scientist, so I have no knowledge of any of this, right? I'm not a petroleum geologist. I have no idea. And I try to leave science to the scientists because but my instinct I would more likely to believe what Russia says than what the West says about this kind of thing. So that's my thoughts on that. Do you have anything more on that one, Terry?
I don't know anything about it.
Yeah, I don't really know much about it either.
Interesting. I mean, I'd be interested to learn more. I might be looking up this abiotic oil thing.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It is.
All right. Here's one for you. It's on my channel, but it's for you. What Terry thinks about black magic Ouija. Is that Ouija? Is that the Ouija board?
Yeah, Ouija.
Okay.
Well, I think you shouldn't play around with these things. Like I said earlier, Ouija board is another tool of divination. You have a board with letters, some words on it, numbers, and then you have a planchard that you move around, to spell out words or ask questions. It's another thing that is a form of divination, and we're not to be playing around with these things. So I'll just say that it's just another form of divination, and it's, not something that we're supposed to be going to, I think there's something, again, about having faith. We're not supposed to be seeking answers from anything but God. We're supposed to put our faith in that, not in the material world, not in these tools. And now black magic is just a term used for a type of magic that is generally Saturnian. So
what does that mean? Saturnian.
So there's different, it's broadly, people have different ideas about it, but when we talk about black magic, we're talking about magic that's on that polarity of restriction, of kind of heaviness, of difficulty. So Saturnian would refer to the planet Saturn, and a lot of magicians utilize the different planetary alignments in their magic. So a black magician would generally be more Saturnian in nature. This is why they wear all black. It's why black is a power color. If you want to get into it, there's reasons for this. The six-pointed star, for example, is another Saturnian image. There's all kinds of connections to that in the occult. So, I don't think it's necessarily bad. Black doesn't mean bad necessarily. There's a difference between black and baneful, but at the end of the day, we're not supposed to be practicing magic.
All right.
But then Aleister Crowley says that magic is just any act that's in alignment with the will. So technically, maybe everything is magic, but we should be, if that is the case, then our words should be speaking goodness into the world and, speaking abundance and speaking what is godly and holy. So Yeah, I don't think you should mess around with that stuff.
All right. I'll take that for an answer. All right. Caleb, a Kanye music fan or too edgy? Well, I just don't know it. I haven't listened to it. I am that, when I was a kid, I will just be honest with you all. This is part of why I'm such a nerd. My parents were very strict about what music and television I could watch. And when I first got a radio in my bedroom, it was a clock radio. The rule was that it had to be tuned to NPR. So on the weekends, it would be folk music, and on the weekdays, it would be classical music. And at one point, when I was like 10 or 11, I changed the channel on the radio, and I listened to a rap station just to annoy my parents, and it caused a huge amount of drama in the household. That was quite a bit of drama in the household. So so I just don't know rap music. I will never forget when I took civil rights and the law when I was in college to learn about censorship and free speech. We listened to the entire album of Nasty as They Wanna Be by Two Live Crew, which is pretty nasty. It's pretty gross, but we were learning about obscenity law and how Dr. Henry Louis Gates had defended the album in court because Florida had outlawed it as pornography. And so we listened to Nasty as They Wanna Be, and then we read Henry Louis Gates' testimony about how it was legal. So that's one of my biggest rap experiences. What about you, Terry? What do you think about Kanye?
I am a Kanye fan. I love Kanye.
Okay.
Somebody mentioned his album College Dropout. Definitely a classic. I love him. He's great. Okay. He's brilliant. Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to break into song right now, but he's got a lot of bangers. I love rap music too. So
that's great. Okay. Well, I do remember George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Yeah, good one too.
That was a great moment in television. And if I remember correctly, the guy who did the Austin Powers movies, the Saturday Night Live guy, was standing next to him, right? What's his name? Myers or something like that?
Myers, yeah. That was like, a fun moment.
Yeah, he was just like, what, and it was just kind of random. He was like on a telethon for Hurricane Katrina, and he was very new. Those were like early years of Kanye West, and he was just like, George Bush doesn't care about black people, and it was like, whoa, he said that on television.
Yeah, very. I like that about him, and he's not afraid to say what he thinks, even if it's unpopular.
Yeah.
Yeah, he still gets in trouble today for his comments. And, he got in that big controversy about like Jewish businessmen. He said something about that got all put out of order. I mean, I felt like, it was just people were freaking out at him about something that I hear plenty of people say, and also just, He's a bit silly, but he's got a wisdom to him as well. I don't know. And he's a great artist and very creative and, complicated individual, but I like him.
Okay. Very good. All right. And super chats continue to come in. So there we go. All right. So is Saddam Hussein bad? Was the war about oil by the imperialists? What was real and what was not real? Do you want me to answer that first, or do you want to go ahead, Terry?
Well, what can I say? He's complicated. Yeah, he was bad in some ways. Yeah, he wasn't a great guy. The invasion of Iraq and, his murder was evil as well. And, even probably more evil than allowing him to continue to run the country, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I can really answer that exactly. It was a pretty tough time, growing up and seeing that. I remember when he was killed and they put images of it like on newspapers and stuff, and it was just so horrifying. Anyway, yeah, I can say that, yeah, he was a bad guy, but he was also, it's a complicated situation again.
Yeah, so my take on that definitely a nuanced one. So first of all, I do think that Iraq was a socialist country under his leadership, right? Which generally Marxists will say, well, it wasn't a communist Marxist-Leninist government, but I think that Ba'athist Arab socialism was socialism, and I think that Syria is a socialist country under Bashar Assad and the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party, and I think that Iraq was as well. I think Saddam Hussein was a leader of the Arab people in their national liberation struggle. He nationalized the oil, and he created a lot of infrastructure, and he raised a lot of people out of poverty, and he did some good things. That said, his neighbor was Iran, and Iran also had an anti-imperialist revolution. And Iran's revolution, the Iranians are Persians, and the Iraqis are Arabs. And Iran's revolution was led by Shia Muslims, and it was a religious revolution. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. He was himself a Sunni, but he advocated a secular government, and he was aligned with a secular government aligned with the Soviet Union, Baathism. Iran is a Persian country, and they had a religious revolution based on Shia Islam. And it's very clear that the USA manipulated both forces against each other. And the Iraq-Iran war, it started out with the USA basically egging on and giving permission to Iraq to invade Iran and kill thousands of innocent people, which Saddam Hussein did. And the reason Saddam Hussein did it was because Iraq is a majority Shia country, and he feared that the Shia clerics in Iraq would try to inspire their people to have some kind of Islamic Shia revolution against him. And he feared that would be bad for him, especially because he was a Sunni, and because he was for a secular government. And so, it was very clear that the strategy of the United States during the Carter years was to manipulate anti-imperialists against each other, right? Rather than have it be at the beginning of the Cold War, it was just capitalism versus communism. They realized that if they have a light switch effect like that, that leads to a situation where in Vietnam, pretty soon the communists can win as people are unhappy with what they have. So instead, it became, let's find various anti-imperialists and let's boost some of them and let's persecute others and let's make it a complete clusterfuck so that the USA can kind of win by default. And so at the beginning of the Iraq-Iran war, the USA was clearly on the side of Iraq against Iran. But about halfway through, the USA flipped and started supporting Iran against Iraq. And the war went on for 10 years, and at least 1 million people died. And the U.S. government and the Israeli government were proven to be on both sides of it throughout the conflict. And it was devastating. I worked for Ramsey Clark, and Ramsey Clark, who I worked for, was Saddam Hussein's lawyer when he was on trial. And he quit. He resigned in protest because he said, this is not a real trial. He said, this is not a real trial. This is just a show trial. And Ramsey Clark said many times in Iraq, and you can watch the interviews he gave, that if this trial of Saddam Hussein is not at least perceived as a fair trial, there will not be peace in Iraq because, there were certain tribal areas that benefited from Saddam Hussein, certain tribal areas that, were persecuted at his hands, and that the trial of Saddam Hussein, if you wanted a stable Iraq, needed to be conducted in a way that it was at least viewed as a fair trial. But we now know that was not the intent of the United States. The USA wanted to inspire ethnic and tribal divisions in Iraq. And the way Saddam Hussein was killed is they had people from a rival ethnic group, a rival tribe, yelling at him as they executed him. It was almost like a lynching. It wasn't like a formal execution. It was just a crowd of people who didn't like him, taking him upstairs and hanging him, and that was done to incite religious and ethnic division in Iraq. It was just done to incite the Sunnis against the Shias, to incite different ethnic groups against each other. So, the whole thing was, I think Saddam Hussein did many bad things as the leader of Iraq, no question about it. He killed a lot of Iranians. He killed a lot of Kurdish people. He killed a lot of Shia Muslims who revolted against him in the 1990s. He was a very authoritarian leader, that said, this is a developing country that was under attack. He came to the aid of the Palestinians and was very pro-Palestine, and that is certainly recognizable. And his invasion of Kuwait was done with the permission of the American government. The USA basically wanted to make an example out of him. The Gulf War was a complete fraud. Basically, he went to the United States and said, hey, can I invade Kuwait? And the U.S. government said, yes, go ahead, gave him permission to invade Kuwait, and then made a hysterical media campaign about his invasion of Kuwait, They had the woman who claimed that they were throwing babies out of incubators, and that turned out to be completely fake. There were no babies being thrown out of incubators, and the woman had never been there, and that was all staged for the media. The Naria testimony, that is what they based the Iraq War on, or the first Gulf War. The Gulf War was based on this false testimony that was shown on TV, the Naria testimony. And what basically happened is Iraq invaded Kuwait with U.S. permission, and then the USA started demonizing them for invading Kuwait, and then they retreated, and they got onto the highways of Iraq, and all these, Iraqis are on the highways trying to retreat back to Iraq because they thought they invaded Iraq with U.S. permission, and then the USA is sending the military in to drive them out, and the USA cowardly murdered them all in the air, right? You don't kill people while they're retreating, but they called it the highway of death. And the Iraq War basically ended with the U.S. military just bombing and murdering all the Iraqis as they were fleeing. It's a nuanced situation, but the United States, they use Saddam Hussein sometimes. They tricked Saddam Hussein into doing things on their behalf, but Saddam Hussein presided over trying to raise Iraq up to be a modern country using socialist planned economy aligned with the Soviet Union. So it's a mixed bag. But that said, supporting Saddam Hussein now is completely ridiculous, right? Because the Baathism in Iraq is over. It's just done, right? Iran is the center of anti-imperialism in the Middle East right now, and that's very clear. The Houthis are aligned with Iran. Hezbollah is aligned with Iran. Iran is who the Israelis are targeting. And Saddam Hussein killed so many Iranians that if you go around talking about how great Saddam Hussein is, you're basically on the side of Israel at this point because Iran is the main target. So Baathism and all of that, it was one part of the history of anti-imperialism in the Middle East. Also in the 1990s, I'll just mention this because I was close to Ramsey Clark to some degree. I mean, I went over to his house and, I met with Ramsey Clark. I worked for the IAC. That's how for his nonprofit, the International Action Center, that's how my career in media got going. And one of the best things that Ramsey Clark ever did was in the 90s, the USA put these horrendous sanctions on Iraq that wouldn't allow them to have medicine, wouldn't allow them to have chlorine to purify their water. And so what Ramsey Clark did was that he went to the airport with a bunch of medicine and with a bunch of chlorine, with a bunch of stuff. And he had a press conference and he said, I'm going to Iraq with all this medicine. And I want you to prosecute me. Please charge me with the crime of feeding Iraqis so that I can make a show for the whole world of this. And he loaded up his plane and he went to Iraq and he delivered the medicine. And they froze his bank accounts. And they never charged him because they knew it would create publicity. It would create publicity for what was going on. And the sanctions on Iraq that were imposed on Iraq in the 90s were genocidal. They killed at least 1.2 million people. At least 500,000 under the age of 12 died. And what the USA did in the 1990s to Iraq was a crime against humanity. This was back before Russia was back in business, back before... when the USA, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, the USA had the ability to just cancel countries. And Cuba and North Korea and Iraq, all of them were subjected to this all-out economic warfare where, people were starving, people died because the USA just cut them off from the world economy. And what was done to Iraq was a crime against humanity. That doesn't mean that Saddam Hussein was all good. It's a nuanced conversation. But anyway, that's my thoughts on that.
It definitely is. Yeah, it's not something you could say one way or the other, good or bad. It's beyond that.
Indeed. I will say that Iraq, before Saddam Hussein's overthrow, Iraq did very much sound like an old school communist government. And people don't realize that. You wouldn't realize that now. But, Saddam Hussein very much, even though he was not a communist, he was a Baathist. His government saw itself as aligned with Cuba, out of the Soviet tradition, and they spoke in terms of revolutionary socialism, anti-imperialism, etc. And that regardless of the bad things they did espouse like a standard leftist Cold War ideology until the end. And if you did not know that, you would not realize that. And that before he died, before the U.S. invasion, just a couple years before, Saddam Hussein wrote a romance novel called Zabiba and the King, which I own a copy of, which is very interesting. And it's basically the king of ancient Iraq is visited by this woman who's a widow, and they have conversations about statecraft and running the government. And the conversations are very clearly Saddam Hussein kind of telling his people kind of, the wisdom. And one of the big points is that the king's sons are not fit to rule the country after the king dies. And many people said that was Saddam Hussein basically saying, don't put Uday and Qusay in charge when I'm dead. Like, please don't. My sons, they're spoiled brats. They're incompetent. They're, and yes, I am the founder of the country. And yes, they're a big deal because I'm their dad. But please, when I die, just do not put my sons in power, which I think is kind of hilarious. And he couldn't just come out and say that. But, he was basically saying, and because that happens, right? I mean, in Iraq, in Syria, Bashar Assad is in power because he was the son of the founder, Hafez Assad. And that happens in countries where you have an anti-colonial revolution, where there's kind of a cult of personality around the leader. It tends to be their son who becomes the leader. And Saddam Hussein blatantly told the people through his romance novel, Zabibba and the King, do not put Uday and Qusay in charge. They are incompetent. And I think that's kind of amusing and it's kind of hilarious on some level, but it's also like interesting, and that the message was delivered in a novel, not like an official proclamation. And that sometimes that happens in socialist and anti-imperialist countries. So that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, go read Zabibba and the King. It's actually fascinating. And I don't fully understand it because I'm not Iraqi, but I don't get the context of it. But it's a very patriotic novel. It talks about the beauty of Iraqi culture, etc. And it's a romance novel, and it gets a little like, are PG-13 a little bit at some points. There's a long rant about how women's mouths are very, very sexy, and how women's mouths are like, very sexually attractive, which I thought was kind of an odd thing, but it talked about how like traditional Muslim women would cover their mouths because the mouth could be considered a sexual body part and all of that. I remember reading that in there, and I was like, that's interesting, but and he talks about how beautiful Iraqi women are and things like that. It's interesting to see Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's romance novel, I would recommend it. It's certainly not something that a typical American would read. It's an insight into how kind of an authoritarian anti-imperialist government operates. It's an insight into Arab culture. It's a lot of things. So go read Zabibba and the King.
Should we read it? If you're one of my subscribers, let me know if you want me to read that.
There you go. It's on Amazon, Zabibba and the King. You can get the English translation. So there you go.
Wow.
All right. Very good. Next, Gavin is referring to Professor John Mack, who did extensive research on extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, which could be described as demonic. That's very important. So these are space aliens. These are extraterrestrials that Gavin is describing. Does that bring you any more clarity on demons being
interdimensional? Would mean that they're, not necessarily from outer space.
Okay.
Just in my view, all interdimensional beings that people have interactions with are of the spirit realm. Or of some kind like that. So if they're anti-communist, I don't know what to say about that exactly.
Sounds like they're libertarians. They're anti-Christian and anti-communist. They're Ayn Rand aliens, right? They're Ayn Rand demons, right?
Well, because there's like the godless that, communists are often, decried as godless, but the right has, their own godlessness. And so probably just trying to appeal to whatever godlessness is going to, work with the individual that they're sitting in front of. If they were interacting with somebody in a communist country or has that kind of background, they'd probably lean into a different thing. The reality is demons are just going to use whatever they can to manipulate you. Yeah,
I've heard Satan referred to as the tempter, right? Or right, the tempter, or the what do they call him? The opposition or something like that. It's just a game to get
adversary.
The adversary, yes. Yeah.
And everybody interacts with these beings all the time. They just don't know it. To have one manifest in front of you is one thing, or to conjure one up through some sort of divination. They're talking to you every day in your mind.
Wow.
You think your thoughts are your own. They're not a lot of the time. So for those of you watching who have intrusive thoughts, who have thoughts that are condemning you, that's not from God. That's not you. And you need to start to recognize that so that you can overcome the spiritual, forces that are trying to destroy you. We call it ourselves, we blame ourselves because we're used to hearing it in our head. So we think it's us. But that's how the devil gets in.
Wow.
So, and don't argue with them either. Just be like, notice it and don't interact with it. And these things will kick up and get angry. You'll see them get even louder. But over time, you watch it, they'll start to dissipate.
Wow.
So anyway, yeah, just a little bit of tidbit, you get those thoughts in your head sometimes condemning you. That's not you. That's spiritual warfare that you're going through.
Wow.
So everybody's interacting with them, but you don't know because you haven't been shown it. You haven't been taught it. Most people aren't aware. It's everybody goes through it.
Well, this is one thing about, I will say that in as I delve into this line of thought, right, I never would have considered a lot of this stuff years ago. But as I've become more religious, and I do attend a church. I'm not a member, but I do attend a church that I'm very close to. That we have a bond over the fact that we both support North Korea. One thing that is clear is that part of the way Satan gets to you is when you're alone, right? You need to be around other people, right? And the pandemic, the lockdowns was very convenient for that, right?
Yeah, people had breakdowns completely.
Yeah.
I mean, I went through a total spiritual transformation because of that. The isolation totally changed me. That's why I became a Christian again, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because of the isolation, it forced you to re-examine your faith.
No, it's because of the recognition of spiritual warfare.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. I realized, I kind of had an awakening.
Wow. And that also practices that have been done spiritually. So when I was a communist activist, especially after Occupy Wall Street, I would, how you get a song in your head? I would get a chant in my head. Right. And chanting at protests, right, is something communists do, is something people generally do. But if you actually look at the history, chanting goes back thousands of years. It's a religious practice, right? It's a way that people pray and all that. It has spiritual power. Chanting does. If you chant a phrase, you say it over and over and over again, it becomes more true when you say it, right? So, and that's something that a lot of people don't think about because they will chant really ugly things, right? Yes. And if you chant really ugly things, you're putting ugly spiritual energy into the world. But if you chant something really, really beautiful, that's a good thing. Like, for example, the Hare Krishna religious sect, they chant the name of God over and over and over again. And they chant, Jesus, 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 Krishna, 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 Allah, Allah, Allah. They just chant the name of God all day long because they believe it brings holy energy into the world. And they believe that all the major religions are different faces of God, right? And that chanting is a very spiritual thing that communists who claim to not be spiritual at all do, right? They do chanting. And if you go back to India and ancient India, you go to the Eastern countries, a lot of religious practice involves people just chanting a phrase over and over and over again. And then, the Catholic Church, they do the Hail Marys, they do the prayers, they just recite over and over and over again. But if you want to train yourself to think in a different way, a great way to do it is to just repeat things, right? What do you think?
Well, yes, but the real prayer happens when we don't do any of that. Where we actually let ourselves listen to God and what He has to say to us. So, for example, there's when Jesus opens up the Lord's Prayer, He tells us not to, pray like the pagans do, which is to, make these vain repetitions. But instead to, go into our closet and, give thanks to God, basically. He then gives us the Lord's Prayer. So, yeah, somebody repeats it. Use not vain repetitions. And, yeah, that's really popular amongst the New Age now. People are always doing the affirmations, But instead, what Christianity gives us is this situation, and in the Lord's Prayer, it really, I think, and how I interpret it, it's like meant to be how we approach the moment, as well, because we're giving gratitude to God for all the small things that he gives us. We're not asking for more. We're not, other than to like bring about his kingdom, and to be with him. So I don't know. I don't, but then I like listening to Gregorian chants, and I love songs and that kind of thing. So I don't think I don't know. But I agree with you about the chanting thing. And there are certain chants that can be really disturbing as well. And like I said, I repeated the Aleister Crowley quote about how magic is like when we bring our action in accordance with our will. So, I mean, there's something to, the words we say having power. There is power in the word and the tongue as well. So I think there is something to, making certain statements, and we do need to watch it if our statements are negative or if they're positive. Sometimes we speak curses out or blessings. We want to be speaking blessings out with our tongue. So I don't know. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but
indeed. All right. Well, our last super chat. Are gypsies lumpen? So is gypsy a PC word to use? Aren't you supposed to say Roma people? I don't know. I know very, very little about this topic. Do you know anything?
Well, Terry? I don't care about being politically correct, for one. I try to be not. But I will say, no, some gypsies are lumpen, some are not. And not all gypsies are Roma. There's different types of gypsies as well. We don't talk about that. There are different people who are categorized as gypsies who have different lineages. So, the Roma people are probably the biggest group that are called, but not all of them are lumpen. Some of them are normal people.
So it's an ethnicity.
Got away from that ghetto lifestyle, and they're living their best life.
So does the word gypsy refer to an ethnic group, or does it refer to a kind of a semi-criminal? I mean, what does the word mean? I just know that in old novels and stuff in Europe, it's a group of traveling people in Europe or something, right?
It's not necessarily ethnic. It isn't necessarily ethnic, although it is used to describe an ethnic group of people. So the Roma people are, but they're not the only people who get called gypsies or who are considered gypsies. I watched years ago, there were these horrible reality shows I got into. There were, there were two shows that I watched. There was My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, and this deals with a gypsy community in the USA, and they have these extravagant wedding gowns that are just out of this world. Like, if you see them, I don't know if anybody's seen them, but they're wild. They're massive. You can't even get them in a car sometimes. They have to have people help them walk down the aisle. They're huge. They're flamboyant. They're brightly colored. So they become people of interest for this reality show. And of course, they're gypsies. So their lifestyle is all kind of lumpen, really. I mean, it's entertaining. But they had a spinoff as well with some of the women that were on the show called Gypsy Sisters. Now, these women were, Roman Shawl, I think is the name of the ethnic group they belong to. They're white people, technically. They're European descent. But they're technically gypsies. I mean, they very similar lifestyles, some very similar kind of history of persecution, distrust, and most of them are lumpen, but not
so they
all.
Engage in criminal activities, or
not just criminal activities, or they can be like, I mean, yeah, to a certain degree, or they can just kind of live off of the fat of the land. You know, a lot of them, you know, don't work. They collect whatever government handouts they can, you know, generational poverty. And yes, some criminal activity, some shady activity, generally poor reputations, just because they often get into, you know, fights, or they're up to stuff. We'll say that. So yeah, they're up to stuff. But then then there's the traveling people as well. So people who live in caravans in different parts of Europe as well get called gypsies, and they're not necessarily, you know, it's I think calling them lumpen altogether, some of them are, probably a lot of them are, but not all. So.
All right.
Probably shouldn't judge. Yeah. Don't prejudge people.
Wow. All right. Well, you know way more about the topic than I do. I know nothing about that. So that was very educational.
Now, I may know a little bit more about.
There you go. Now I'm going to have to go research that. So that's when you know you've had a good conversation, when there's like 3 things to go research afterwards. So, well, Terri, every time you come on this channel, it is amazing. And you never cease to amaze me. So thank you for coming on. Thank you for doing your thing. Everyone go subscribe to Terri's channel. She does great stuff. Terri Strange. Go subscribe.
For my guests that are here too, you know about Caleb. If you're not subscribed, please do.
All right. All right. Well, anything you'd like to say before we call it a night?
No.
All right. Well, it's just struck midnight here, so I'm going to say good night. So good night, everybody.
Bye.